In historical terms, NXT is still relatively young in many ways, as it's only been around since 2010. But in that period, it's been able to put out some great storylines. Yes, the developmental show has been no stranger to an entertaining angle or two, but what are the best of these angles? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now. And where better to start than with arguably the greatest NXT story of them all, the saga of Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa. That's right, there was nowhere else we could realistically start with this one, as even now, several years on, this probably still ranks as the high watermark of the black and gold brand. What made this one so great? Well, it involved two of the best wrestlers WWE had on their roster at the time, each operating at the top of their game. And it all started with them undergoing a fantastic tag team run during the mid-2010s. Once Tommaso Ciampa decided he'd had enough of being part of a team with Gargano, however, things would change very quickly, as following their loss to the Authors of Pain at May 20th, 2017's TakeOver Chicago, he'd attack his now former partner and become the biggest heel on the brand in the process. How would Johnny Wrestling respond to this? Well, he'd be out for revenge, and that revenge would eventually come when the pair took part in a series of high-profile bouts the following year. Sadly though, it seemed like the universe never wanted to see this one get the grand finale it deserved, because every time we reached that point, outside forces would put a stop to it. It didn't matter if it was injury or a pesky worldwide shutdown. Gargano Ciampa never managed to get the satisfying conclusion we all wanted it to have. Of course, none of this takes away from how great the feud was outside of that though. No, even if the ending never fully arrived, the journey getting there was unparalleled in terms of the kind of storytelling WWE was putting on at the time. So good was it, in fact, many people still think of this first when they think of great angles from NXT. But it's not the only great angle the developmental brand has had over the years. No, there have been others too. Others which have approached this level of greatness. Hell, there have even been others which centered on partners becoming enemies, as can be seen in our next subject, the feud between Carmelo Hayes and Trick Williams. Yes, you can call this one Shawn Michaels' spin on an old classic, because here he took an angle we'd all seen before and made it his own. And the way he did that was to, as Triple H had done before him, take two of the best performers on the show at the time and having them start out their runs by teaming up together. Obviously though, this wasn't destined to last forever, so after a couple of years of ruling the roost together, with Hayes serving as the leader and Williams the young Padawan in many ways, it became apparent a turn was coming sooner rather than later. How did we know a turn was coming? Well, after Trick was laid out backstage by a mystery assailant, and Mello began acting a little suspiciously about the entire thing, we could put two and two together and see where things were going. Before this turn would come though, there would be plenty of moments of teasing the fans, as Hayes tried to gaslight both his partner and his fans into believing it was someone else responsible for attacking Trick Willie. Of course, we could all see through this, however. And so when Carmelo eventually nailed his now former friend with a steel chair at February 4th, 2024's Vengeance Day, all we wanted was for the babyface to get his revenge. And he would do just this as it happened, because after beating Hayes at April 6, 2024's Stand and Deliver show, Williams went on to beat Ilya Dragunov for the NXT World title just a few weeks later, with this marking the ultimate victory for the up-and-coming star, as it meant not only had he gotten one over on the man who'd betrayed him, but he'd also become champion too. And with him effectively being run out of NXT at this point, it's left Trick with the whole brand to himself, now free from the influence of Carmelo forever, or at least it'll leave him free from his influence until the two inevitably find themselves back on the same brand together on the main roster. Can we expect a satisfying continuation of their story once that happens? Quite possibly, as with there being a better line of communication between Raw, SmackDown, and NXT these days, the transition process is often a lot smoother, and that's been evident in the rise of Bron Breakker, with his rise starting all the way down in NXT during the early 2020s. Now, it should have always seemed obvious to anyone with eyeballs that Bron Breakker was going to be a star, as he has everything required to get over in the halls of WWE. After all, he's got the look, he's got the presence, and he can even wrestle too. Back in the Vince McMahon era though, it was never a given that anyone was going to succeed, and so that's why we're lucky Bron managed to find himself going down the correct path right from the get-go then, as from day one, he was treated like a future ace. Need any evidence of this? Well, how about the fact that when NXT morphed into its 2.0 incarnation and a whole new host of characters were added, he was immediately pegged as the top star of these new faces, with this being why he was pretty quickly thrust into the main event picture when he got a chance to challenge then NXT champion Tommaso Ciampa for the title. And the son of Rick Steiner wouldn't just challenge here, no, he'd win. with this being something which immediately put the rest of the roster on notice as to who the new top dog in town was. What happened following that? Well, Braun's rise continued, with him getting big wins over main roster talent such as Dolph Ziggler. Hell, at one point he'd even score a victory over the mighty Gunther, a rare achievement these days. And by the time his run on top was done then, he'd have made mincemeat of just about everyone there. But even when he lost the NXT title, the Georgia native wasn't quite done in the developmental brand yet. No, he still had great heel and tag team runs in him, with his time spent as a duo with Baron Corbin in 2024 probably representing the best work of the Lone Wolf's entire career. Of course, it was always only going to be a matter of time until Braun moved up to the main roster, however, as NXT simply couldn't contain him forever. So that's why in recent months he's made his way over to Raw, where his path of dominance has continued seamlessly. That said, if he wants to be as dominant as our next subject, he still has a long way to go yet, because when it comes to Asuka, her time in developmental was spent undergoing one of the most impressive undefeated streaks in modern memory. Allow us to take you back to 2015 for a moment, a period many people consider to be the high watermark of NXT as a brand. It was there that after spending the first part of her career becoming a superstar on the Japanese Joshi scene with her murder clown character Kana, Kanako Urai signed on the dotted line with WWE and was there immediately rebranded as Asuka. Who was Asuka? Well, as we would soon all find out, she was an unbeatable force of nature. Yes, pretty quickly, the woman who at that point in time could very easily have been called the best female wrestler in the world started racking up victory after victory after victory. It didn't matter who was put in front of her. Dana Brooke, Cameron, Emma, they all fell in short order to the might of the Empress of Tomorrow. So it should come as no surprise then that before long, Asuka began setting her sights on winning the NXT Women's title, a title then being held by Bayley. And for as great as Bayley was and is, even she proved unable to stand up to the Japanese phenomenon when the two finally met in the ring with the gold on the line at TakeOver Dallas on April 1st, 2016. That's right, this was the start of a title run which would go on to become legendary in the halls of Full Sail University, as by the time it was over, Asuka would have held the gold for a full 522 days, a record which still stands to this day. And it's not even as if anyone would beat her for the belt by the time things were said and done. No, the only reason she lost it at all was because she got called up to the main roster, where she continued on with her undefeated streak on Raw for a while. Of course, she isn't the only person with a legendary lengthy title run in the developmental brand, however, as a few years later, the same thing would happen with Gunther and his NXT United Kingdom title reign. Yes, we never said this video was going to be limited to the US branch of NXT, as the UK version certainly had its high points over the years too, being that it first introduced WWE fans to the likes of Rhea Ripley, Toni Storm, Pete Dunne, and Tyler Bate, just to name a few. That said, of all the success stories of NXT UK, perhaps none are bigger than the man who then went by the name of Walter, as today he currently stands as one of the biggest stars on Raw and the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion of all time. Not that lengthy runs on top were anything unusual to him before this though, because after winning the NXT UK title from Pete Dunne at TakeOver New York on April 5th, 2019, he'd go on to hold that particular piece of hardware for 870 days. A staggering achievement in anyone's book. And it's not as if he had an easy time during this period either, because, well, for most of us navigating a global shutdown was hard enough, of opponents such as Joe Coffey, Tyler Bate, and Ilya Dragunov while he was at it. In fact, his match against the latter on the October 29th, 2020 episode of NXT UK was so savage and hard-hitting, even the toughest wrestlers out there must have winced when they saw the pair knocking absolute lumps out of one another, with the empty arena setting to this one making it so that every point of impact could be heard with painful clarity. But while Walter would win that bout, in the end, it would be Dragunov who took his title from him in an epic rematch almost a year later at TakeOver 36, with this finally marking the end of one of the most impressive title reigns of all time. How would the Austrian respond to such a loss? Well, as we all know now, he'd head up to the main roster, change his name to Gunther, and there, start a whole new path of destruction. And while he was doing this, he would have a showdown or two with our next subject, a man who also holds claim to one of the greatest stories in NXT history, as it was back during the early days of the brand that Sami Zayn's journey towards the world title helped establish the entire thing. Now, we all love a good babyface chase for the title angle. Hell, there's a reason it worked so well for the likes of Cody Rhodes in recent years. And that reason is because we all like to see the underdog have to overcome the odds and get what they deserve. That said, while Cody is certainly a great babyface, perhaps even he isn't as lovable as Sami is. And it's for this reason then that his journey to the top in the mid-2010s was so special. All you had to do was look at his face every time he ate a loss during this period, and you felt terrible for him. You just wanted to see him succeed so badly. So when he eventually managed to string a series of wins together and earned that shot at then-champion Bo Dallas then, it felt like the entire world was behind the Quebec native. Unfortunately though, this wouldn't be Sami's moment quite yet. No, Triple H was playing the long game with him, and so it was that Adrian Neville, the man better known today as Pac, would be the one who eventually dethroned Dallas instead. But that didn't mean Sami was completely down and out. No, he'd continue to work his way back up the ranks until finally, after every hurdle had been placed in his path, he got another one-on-one shot at the gold at TakeOver Our Revolution on December 11th, 2014. And it was there that in one of the most emotionally satisfying moments in that brand's history, Zayn managed to win the big one and at last hold the title above his head. Sure, he would lose it to Kevin Owens pretty quickly after this, but the title run itself was never the story here. No, the story was Sami proving to himself that he could beat the champ and that he could be the man, Rocky Balboa style. That said, not all good stories in NXT have been about people fighting over a belt. No, some have been more about the mystery, such as was the case with the 2018 Who Attacked Aleister Black angle. Okay, this one did kind of involve the NXT title, as the attack happened right as Black was about to take part in a three-way bout for the gold against Johnny Gargano and Tommaso Ciampa. But once the current House of Black leader was laid out by a mystery assailant on the August 8th episode of NXT, his focus shifted away from the gold and instead moved on to trying to find out who had dared to strike him in such a cowardly manner. Of course, he wasn't the only one who wanted to find out the answer to this question though, as over the weeks which followed, fans and performers alike were all trying to solve the mystery, with the only person who seemed to know the answer to the question, outside of the attacker themselves that was, being Nikki Cross. And since Nikki Cross was completely unhinged and her word couldn't exactly be trusted, this didn't make it easier for Aleister to confirm things. In the end though, he wouldn't have to, because after much speculation, on the October 17th episode of NXT, the attacker revealed themselves to be none other than Johnny Gargano, with this being explained away as Johnny growing jealous that Black had gotten himself tied up in a feud with Tommaso Ciampa that he felt was his and his alone to deal with. So obviously then, with Gargano now being a heel, it meant that the two would have to have a blow-off at TakeOver War Games just 1 month later. A blow-off which might very well have been match of the night, and which ended with the babyface getting his revenge in the form of a victory. How would things progress from there? Well, Black would move on to other things, such as teaming up with Ricochet in the 2019 Dusty Rhodes Tag Team Classic, all before then being drafted up to the main roster and spending a period there too. No, his time on the main roster wasn't a great run for him, but maybe, if as some have speculated might happen, he eventually returns to WWE once his current AEW contract runs out, he'll get a second chance at the whip, perhaps this time a romance angle involving his wife, Zelina Vega. After all, we all know romance angles in wrestling can work well. NXT proved this with their Index story during the latter days of the Black and Gold era. What was the story to this one? Well, it was that in early 2021, relatively normal member of the Way, Indy Hartwell, began finding herself to be the object of Dexter Lumis's affections. And since Lumis was a mute, apparent serial killer whose only way of showing love was to act in the strangest manner possible, it's understandable she was a bit freaked out by this at first. As time went on though, Dexter began slowly winning over the object of his affections with his unique charms, and this eventually led to the two becoming a bit of an on-screen item, something which, at least initially, drew the ire of Indy's stablemates Johnny Gargano, Candice LeRae, and Austin Theory. Of course, eventually they'd come to love Lumis too though, and so it was after months of a whirlwind romance, everything would culminate in a marriage proposal on the August 17th episode of NXT. But in a twist to the way these things usually go, it wouldn't be the man who did the proposing here. No, instead it was Hartwell who made her intentions clear, with the wedding being set to go ahead from there on September 14th, the date of the first NXT episode under the new 2.0 rebranding. That's right, it was quite a way to kick off a new era, and while it wasn't exactly Randy Savage and Miss Elizabeth, it was still a memorable segment and a worthy conclusion to one of NXT's most memorable angles over the years. Sadly though, this would also mark the beginning of the end for the couple, because pretty soon after their marriage was made official here, Lumis would find himself out of a job, and so the two would be separated once more. But even if it was a sad way for things to conclude, anyone who's spent any length of time watching wrestling should know that breakups are the way things so often go. After all, it's the way our next great angle eventually ended, with that being the story of the Undisputed Era. Yes, back in the latter half of the 2010s, there was no more dominating force in NXT than that which was made up of Adam Cole, Kyle O'Reilly, Bobby Fish, and Roderick Strong. And the reason for that was because when all four men were paired together, their combined skills made them nigh on unbeatable. Yes, it didn't matter who was going up against them, the Undisputed Era almost always stood tall. And this was why at one point they were quite literally dripping in gold when Cole was NXT World Champion, Roddy the North American Champion, and Red Dragon the Tag Team Champions. Unfortunately though, as with all good things, this one had to end eventually, and so it was that after years of making things like War Games their own, dissension began to sow itself amongst the ranks of the stable when Kyle O'Reilly went on something of a main event singles run in 2020. How would Adam Cole respond to both this and O'Reilly's subsequent attempts to have Finn Balor join the UE? Well, with extreme jealousy. Which was exactly why at TakeOver Vengeance Day on February 14th, 2021, he just about kicked the Vancouver native's head off with a super kick, a move which formally marked the downfall of the stable. Yes, now with Cole and O'Reilly at odds, it was left to Fish and Strong to choose sides, with this all eventually becoming too much and causing the whole thing to implode. Sure, all parties involved would eventually try to rebuild these friendships when they later moved over to AEW, but even that couldn't last forever it seems, because with the wounds from that initial attack running too deep, we're now looking at a stage where it doesn't look like we'll ever see all four members of the Undisputed Era on the same page again. Needless to say then, that's a crying shame, because when they were at their peak in NXT during the late 2010s and early 2020s, there was quite simply no one who could match up to them in terms of either their ability in the ring or their sheer force of strength and numbers. So, pour one out for the UE, arguably the greatest stable to ever do it on the Developmental brand. Well, that is if we don't count our next group as an official stable, of course, because while they were never all on the same page in kayfabe, the bonds that tie the Four Horsewomen together remained strong throughout their entire time on the Black and Gold brand. And this led to one of the best overarching stories in the show's history. Now, to tell this one properly, we need to go back to December 12th, 2012. That was the date Sasha Banks had her first televised match against Paige, and in the process became the first of the Four Horsewomen to appear on WWE TV. Of course, she wouldn't be the only one there for long though, because over the course of the 12 months which followed, Charlotte Flair, Bayley, and Becky Lynch would also join her. And with each of these four performers quickly proving themselves to be stars in waiting, it led to a heated competition breaking out to see who would reach the top first. Not that they weren't friends behind the scenes though. No, so close would the quartet become that at one point, Charlotte's father Ric Flair would bestow upon them the name of the Four Horsewomen. On screen though, things were far less civil as each wanted to be the top dog in the division, and this all memorably climaxed in a four-way bout between them at TakeOver Rival on February 11th, 2015, to this date the only time that match has taken place. Who won this one? Well, that would be Sasha Banks, with her victory here spinning her off into even better singles bouts against the likes of Bayley and Lynch. But then all four of the Horsewomen could be counted on to have a great singles match with one another by then, and this was something they proved again and again right up until the point their era on the Developmental brand came to a figure-it end when three of their members, namely Banks, Flair, and Lynch, were called up to the main roster on the July 13th, 2015 episode of Raw. What happened after that? Well, they just kept on dominating, now on the main roster instead. And when Bayley eventually joined them on the A show, their reign of dominance only got stronger. That said, had they not first proven they could be such stars with such a great story in NXT, then things might never have reached this point. But then that just goes to show the importance of the Developmental show and its ability to captivate us with some of the tales it's weaved over the years.